Okay, so um, mission strategies. Sometimes they can feel a bit, well, abstract, right? Or like something happening, way over there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But today we're diving into something the source material says is actually really central to a lot of faith-based work globally.
Church planting. And it's surprisingly relevant even closer to home in places that feel pretty secular.
It really is. There's been a renewed focus, especially in evangelical missions. You see church planting in, vision statements.
Right.
There's this big concern for unreached peoples, which kind of directly leads to planting new churches.
But not just there, right? Even mainline churches are looking at it.
Exactly. Denominations thinking about their future, mainline groups grappling with decline in sort of post-Christian societies. It's on the table.
And the sources we're looking at, they point out something kind of interesting. They suggest that while, the practice often involves planting churches,
Hmm.
the deep theological thinking about why hasn't always kept up. There's this, gap.
Yeah, exactly. And the source argues that gap can be, well, pretty problematic, actually.
Okay.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to walk through this material, look at the biblical arguments, the practical reasons it gives.
And really understand why this perspective sees church planting as, essential to God's whole plan.
Right. Giving you a clear picture of the core arguments driving this specific approach.
So getting past just saying, oh, we plant churches because it seems to work.
Yeah, moving towards understanding the view that sees it as, fundamental to what God's actually doing.
And the source material, it doesn't really hold back, does it?
Not at all. It kicks off with a really strong claim.
Yeah.
Church planting isn't just like a good idea or practical. It says it's a biblical mandate.
A mandate, wow. That definitely ups the stakes.
For sure.
And this isn't just some modern thing. The source mentions historical figures.
Oh, yeah. People like Gisbertus Voetius way back in the 17th century saw it as like one of the three core aims of mission. And later, Georg Weisdom basically said gathering people into the church was the goal. So, yeah, it's got historical roots.
What really grabbed me was how the source connects it to the big sweep of salvation history.
Mm-hmm.
It really unpacks this idea that God consistently works through a people, not just, scattered individuals.
Yeah, that's a key thread. Think about Abraham, right? Called to be a nation, a blessing to all nations.
And then Israel, meant to be that instrument. And when Israel, faltered, the source says the Messiah came to fulfill that.
Yes, becoming that light for the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And then, flowing out of Christ's work, you get the church.
The new people of God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Picking up that historical role. You see it so clearly in 1 Peter, where language originally for Israel
Right, like chosen people, royal priesthood.
is applied directly to the church. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. It's powerful stuff.
So the church carries on that mission being the light, and the source points to Revelation, that final picture.
Yeah, God gathering people from every people, nation, tribe, and tongue, that huge, diverse family.
Okay, so how does God do that? How does he gather all these different people?
And that's where church planting comes in, according to the source. It's presented as the main way these kingdom communities get formed among all peoples, all for God's glory.
There's that quote, isn't there? If the church is at the heart of God's work.
We need not be embarrassed about making it the heart of mission. Yeah, it's a strong statement.
That really flips the script, doesn't it? From church being just a result of mission to being central to it.
Totally. And it ties it right back to Jesus' own words, I will build my church, Matthew 16.
And the argument is, for him to build it globally, he has to plant it locally.
That's the idea. Local churches, these specific gatherings, they have to be called into existence. The Greek word ecclesia, it means both the big universal church and these local groups.
So he builds the universal by planting and growing the local. Makes sense.
And then there's Ephesians 5, Christ loving the church like his bride, giving himself for her, sanctifying her.
It frames church planting as, Christ's own work, not just our strategy.
Exactly. Something noble, close to God's heart, commanded and powered by Christ himself. It's way more than just one method of evangelism.
Right. Evangelism should lead to church formation in this view.
Yeah, the church isn't an afterthought. It's the object of his love, the instrument of his service.
Which brings us straight to the Great Commission, Matthew 28. The source says this actually requires church planting.
It zooms in on those two commands.
Yeah.
Baptize and teach obedience.
Okay.
Baptizing, it argues, isn't just personal. It's the sign you're entering the new community.
Like joining the group, not just saying, I believe.
That's the argument, yeah. Look at Acts. When people believed, they were added to their number.
Added to the local church.
Right. That language implies joining a new community, breaking from the old. Baptism was that public mark. In Acts 2, being added happens right alongside being saved.
Okay, yeah, I see that link. Being brought to Christ and added to the church seem almost synonymous in places like Acts 11.
Precisely. So from this perspective, becoming a believer biblically means being integrated into a local church. Then there's the second command, teaching obedience.
You can't really do that solo, can you? Living out Christ's commands, showing kingdom values, it needs community.
Exactly. The commands are for a community. The kingdom is shown through a people. So the source argues where these communities don't exist.
So you got to create them.
Right. So mission is incomplete if it doesn't result in planting churches everywhere. Making disciples of all nations means establishing these disciple communities among them.
And that pattern seems really consistent in Acts, doesn't it? Evangelism happens.
And boom, a church forms. Believers gather, meet, get leaders, share life, learn together.
Like that quote from George Peters, wherever Acts 1.8 was faithfully discharged, a church was born.
Yeah, it's just a really fundamental connection. Evangelism, biblically patterned, leads to gathering.
And the church is crucial for new believers. Support, teaching, accountability.
Absolutely. And actually living out the faith together. The source makes a strong point about parachurch groups doing only evangelism.
Right. If there's no connection to a local church, a lot of that fruit can just wither.
That's a huge practical point. Sustained discipleship happens best in that nurturing community, the local church.
Okay, let's look at Paul, Romans 15. His whole strategy was about preaching where Christ wasn't known, right? Not building on others' work.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. He makes this huge claim, saying his pioneering work was done, like complete.
From Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum, that's massive.
I know. How could he possibly say complete? He didn't hit every town, talk to every person.
So what did he mean?
The source argues he meant his work was done because he planted churches in key strategic spots. And the expectation was those churches would then carry on the work, evangelizing and multiplying further out.
So not just counting heads, but establishing, reproducing communities. That makes sense of examples like Ephesus, right? Paul plants it.
And then other churches pop up all over the province of Asia, likely started from Ephesus, even if Paul never went there himself.
Right. So scholars agree church planting was central for Paul to feel like his job was done.
Absolutely. Not just a step towards conversion, but establishing these ongoing, multiplying faith communities was the goal.
So the big takeaway from Paul, mission means planting churches that multiply. A region wasn't really reached until that was happening.
Which brings us to that integration point.
Yeah.
Where understanding the church, ecclesiology, meets understanding mission, missiology.
And the source points out potential weaknesses here. Sometimes mission folks have weak ecclesiology.
Yeah, maybe focusing on the doing without the deep why of the church. And conversely, church theologians might study the church without focusing enough on its outward mission.
Which leads to that powerful Leslie Newbegin quote.
An unchurchly mission is as much of a monstrosity as an unmissionary church. Yeah. The core idea. Church is God's main tool for mission, so planting new ones is essential.
And it's not just about buildings or institutions.
No, definitely not. It's presented as God's chief way of expanding his kingdom, redeeming people everywhere, forming a people who show his glory. It's fundamental to the kingdom spreading. And the point of churches matters.
Churches that actually demonstrate God's reign.
Right. So the mission task, as defined here, is creating and extending these kingdom communities among all peoples through evangelism, discipleship.
Leading to churches that show God's reign in word and deed. Okay?
So that's the biblical foundation laid out.
Right. Now, let's shift. Let's look at the practical side. The source brings out a lot of data, observed results. Why is planting seen as so effective, practically speaking?
Yeah, moving from the why to the how and the what happens. And it starts by tackling some common pushbacks.
Like, don't we already have enough churches?
Right. The source says, well, first, in many places, that's just flat out not true, especially globally.
Okay.
But even where there are churches, it pushes back. Are the needs adequately met? Are there whole groups of people existing churches just aren't reaching?
Good questions. What about the bigger is better argument?
Calls that a false choice.
Yeah.
Points out many big churches are actually the most active planters, and they
Yeah.
keep growing.
And every big church started small.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Plus, studies show churches that plant actually grow faster on average. And think about house churches small, but huge impact, like that leaven parable.
So it's not necessarily competition. You might need both more churches and healthier big ones.
Precisely. And then there's the fear. Most new churches fail.
Is that true?
The source says, no, that's basically a myth. It cites studies showing pretty high survival rates, like 68% after 4 years. Similar closure rates to older churches, actually. And support helps survival rates even more.
Okay, so let's get into the benefits. Benefit 1, new churches grow faster and reach more non-Christians.
Yeah, the stats here are pretty compelling. Baptisms per 100 members. Way higher in new churches. Net growth. Higher in younger churches. Specific examples show really high conversion rates in young plants.
Why is that, do you think? What reasons does the source give?
Several things. Newer communities are often just more receptive. New churches usually have more, evangelistic drive. They kind of have to.
Survival instinct?
Maybe partly. Plus, newcomers get more personal attention. Members are focused, motivated. They're often more flexible worship, outreach not tied to old traditions.
And there's that energy, that excitement of something new.
Exactly. All that adds up to being more effective at reaching people outside the current church circles.
Okay, benefit 2, overcoming the growth plateau.
Yes, the dreaded plateau. The source notes most churches eventually hit one, often under 200 members. Energy turns inward, structures get maxed out.
Reaching new people gets harder.
Right, so the argument is you need continual planting to keep the whole movement growing.
Planting isn't just for new areas then.
No, it's also a strategy for established areas. When a church sends people out to plant, it can actually revitalize the mother church.
How? By creating space.
Partly that, but also by releasing energy, forcing them to raise up new leaders. So the mother church can start growing again, the daughter church grows, and the whole network expands way beyond what the single church could do alone.
Like that diagram in the source. One church plateaus, but the network keeps growing exponentially.
Yeah, and the Bonn, Germany example is great. Tough context, right? But this church of 300 plus intentionally sent out 118 people for 5 daughter churches.
And
Both the mother church and the daughters grew. Total attendance nearly tripled in 7 years.
Right.
Shows what visionary planting can do even with normal resources.
okay, benefit 3, reaching specific people groups existing churches don't.
This is huge, especially globally. The source throws out some big numbers, maybe a third of the world, 1.6 billion people in groups with almost no Christian witness.
Staggering numbers.
And the argument is, these folks likely won't hear the gospel without new churches planted among them.
But it's not just remote tribes.
No, not at all. Even locally, existing churches tend to reach people like themselves. New churches can be intentionally designed to reach specific social groups, subcultures, ethnic communities.
People who might feel out of place or unwelcome in existing churches, like that Roma example in Eastern Europe.
Exactly. Planting new churches specifically for them was seen as key for real community and discipleship. Plus, new churches offer better access geographically in a neighborhood, relationally through new connections.
Benefit 4, saturating cities and regions.
This builds on the last point. Some strategies aim for, say, 1 church per 1,000 people, so everyone's within reach.
And the Munich example showed how big that challenge is, needing 100 new churches just for 1 per 10,000.
Right, and the fastest growth there was in young local churches. Then there's the Guinea case study.
Wow.
Yeah, stagnant for 25 years, then they shift strategy.
To intentional planting, house churches, lay leaders trained on the spot.
And the number of churches jumps from 25 to 150 in 4 years. Members from 1,000 to 6,000. Incredible growth. It really shows the potential impact of a focused, contextual planting strategy for reaching people quickly and widely.
Benefit 5, long-term growth and discipleship. Making sure converts stick.
Yeah, back to the Great Commission's full meaning. Making disciples. It's not enough just to get decisions if people drift away. The source cites those scary 50–80% attrition rates if new believers aren't integrated into a church.
And existing churches might struggle with that, especially with large numbers or people from different backgrounds.
Exactly. Social barriers, feeling unwelcome, style isn't right, maybe the structure can't handle rapid growth. Discipleship happens best in community, and new churches are often vital to provide that, especially during growth spurts.
Benefit 6, stimulating established churches. This counters the competition idea.
Yeah, it argues planting can actually light a fire under older churches.
How so?
Well, when they see a new church effectively reaching people, maybe using creative methods, it can challenge that won't work here attitude.
I can see that.
Seeing that evangelistic energy can motivate them to step up their own outreach. The source mentions a mother church seeing empty seats after sending people out.
And realizing they needed to fill them themselves.
Right. So instead of draining resources, planting can mobilize more people overall, benefiting everyone.
Benefit 7, mobilizing more workers.
This feels pretty intuitive. New church, small team.
All hands on deck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
New folks get pulled into ministry fast because they're needed. It stretches them, helps them find their gifts. Contrast that with studies showing fewer people serve in bigger, older churches percentage-wise.
And sending out planters forces the mother church to raise up new leaders, too.
Win-win again for mobilization.
Okay, last one. Benefit 8, a key to social change. This is fascinating.
Yeah, it talks about social lift. The idea that as people embrace Christian faith and values integrity, work ethic, responsibility, healthier habits,
their lives actually improve tangibly. Social standing, living standards.
that's part of it. But it connects directly to holistic ministry, too. Planting churches in marginalized areas creates communities of hope and empowerment, spiritual, social, educational, economic. Partnering with local churches is seen as super effective for development work.
And it acknowledges that sometimes existing churches might neglect the poor, so new plants among them are necessary.
Right, like that Bangi Dalit example in India. A contextualized movement led to massive growth and transformation because it empowered local leaders and affirmed dignity.
But it's not just about planting among the poor.
No, it challenges middle and upper class churches too, especially new ones, to have a vision for justice and compassion, to actively help the poor work for systemic change.
Like being salt and light in practical ways. Advocacy, equal opportunity.
Exactly. The Nairobi Chapel strategy, the Manila example. Churches getting involved holistically in their communities.
Wow. Okay, that's a really comprehensive case from Bible to practical outcomes, but it does tackle that tricky issue, planting where churches already exist.
Yeah, and it handles it carefully. Acknowledges the potential for tension, misunderstandings.
Sheep stealing, competition.
Right. And it's firm. Competition, denominational flag raising, and sheep stealing should never characterize a church planting effort. A church should never be planted at the cost of another. That's foundational.
Absolutely non-negotiable.
But, it argues, opposition shouldn't just be about protecting turf or personal kingdoms or propping up a dying tradition that isn't actually doing mission.
So when is it justified to plant where churches exist?
It points to situations where many people are nominal Christians, affiliated but not engaged, maybe not even believing basics, and existing churches might not be reaching them.
Or those churches might be, like that quote said, introverted, isolated, having nothing to communicate, basically not contributing to God's mission.
Yeah, that blunt quote highlights that just because a building is there doesn't mean the need is met. There can be a genuine missional need, even with churches around.
And there are practical guidelines for this.
Yes, in a sidebar. Start by honestly assessing, are needs adequately met? Are specific groups unreached? What's the real spiritual landscape? Plant only if there's genuine need.
And don't just assume we have enough churches. Look deeper.
Right. Is mission actually happening effectively through existing churches? If not, planting might be crucial. And then communication.
Talk to existing churches. Explain your purpose. Evangelize the unchurched, not steal sheep. Use data. Build bridges.
And follow through. Cooperate, communicate respectfully, avoid criticism, demonstrate unity. It's about integrity.
Sounds like a tough balance addressing real needs without causing division.
It is. The source tries to provide a framework that's biblically driven, practically smart, and relationally sound.
So pulling it all together, the source makes this powerful argument, doesn't it? Church planting isn't just one option among many.
No, it's presented as woven into the whole biblical story. God's people, Christ's purpose, the Great Commission, Acts, Paul. It's all pointing this way.
And then the practical stuff layers on top effectiveness and outreach, breaking plateaus, reaching specific groups, saturation, discipleship, stimulating older churches, mobilizing workers, social change. The evidence presented is quite compelling.
Leading to that conclusion that church planting is at the very center of a biblical understanding of mission and the key to launching Christian movements.
Yeah.
So given all that and thinking about, the billions still unreached and plateaued churches even in Christianized areas, maybe the question isn't just, do we need more churches?
What's the real question then?
Perhaps it's more like, what does it truly mean for any church, old or new, small or large, to be fully caught up in God's mission right where it is and for the world? What does that missional heartbeat look like?
That's a great question to leave us with. What does this deep dive into these sources make you think about regarding the communities you know and care about, near or far? Definitely something to mull over.